When God calls a person to be a prophet, in simple terms, God has called the person to walk in the prophetic realm. The prophetic realm is a realm of the spirit that is only accessible to prophets. However, if you have not been called to be a prophet, you can still access the realm if you fulfill the conditions required. The main ways of accessing the realm is either through the Holy Spirit or permission from a prophet of God. In the book of 1 Samuel chapter 10 verse 6, King Saul accessed the prophetic realm through the permission of Samuel. After Samuel permitted King Saul to access the prophetic realm, the Holy Spirit came upon him and lifted him to that realm. Another interesting incident of average people accessing the prophetic realm happened in the book of Acts chapter 19 verse 6. In that verse, Apostle Paul laid hands on some disciples who didn't even know the Holy Spirit existed. Immediately they spoke in tongues and prophesied. Fast forward to the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 1 and you will see that Apostle Paul specifically mentions that people should desire the gift of prophecy. Later on in the chapter, Apostle Paul compares speaking in tongues and prophecy and concludes that prophecy is superior to speaking in tongues. The main point of distinction being that speaking in tongues benefits an individual, but prophecy benefits the whole church. In the book of 1 Corinthians chapter 14 verse 39, Apostle Paul asks that believers should desire to prophesy, but at the same time, they should not forbid speaking in tongues. Why am I mentioning all this? Well, this is important to help you understand how to unlock the prophetic realm through speaking in tongues. As I mentioned before, the prophetic is a realm in the spirit. However, speaking in tongues is the vessel that carries you to that realm. If you are very keen, you will notice that prophecy always comes after speaking in tongues. In the case of Apostle Paul laying hands on the disciples, they first spoke in tongues and then they prophesied. In that short while, they prayed in tongues and accessed the prophetic realm, which enabled them to prophesy. But you may ask, what is the benefit of walking in the prophetic realm? In response, I will ask you, why did God have prophets all through the Old Testament and even into the New? Because prophets are the mouthpiece of God. If there are no prophets, the voice of God will also disappear. Do you think it is a joke that God would vow that he will not do anything before he reveals it to prophets in the book of Amos chapter 3 verse 7? Prophets are a beloved lot in the eyes of God. God would readily kill just to save his prophets, as Genesis chapter 20 verse 7 tells us. I hope you now understand why Apostle Paul held the gift of prophecy with high regard. If you have the gift of prophecy, you get to enjoy all the privileges of the prophets. Because prophets have the ability to know what God will do in time to come, their faith is unshakable. The Bible tells us in the book of Hebrews chapter 11 verse 1 that faith is the assurance of things not seen. It then tells us that it is impossible to please God without faith. But guess what? Prophets are able to see things yet to come. That ability makes their faith extremely strong, and with such strong faith, they perform signs and wonders whenever they want. This explains why almost all miracles in the Old Testament were either done by prophets or for prophets. Their position gave them access to high levels of faith, and with that faith, there was nothing that God would not do for them. Prophets can demand for extraordinary things, and God will not say no. Elijah proclaimed that there would be no rain in Israel for 3.5 years, and God did it. Later on, he asked for fire to fall from heaven, and God did it. Other prophets like Isaiah saw Jesus hundreds of years before he was born. They accurately detailed how his life would be. That was such a great achievement, given that the very disciples of Jesus had to rely on what the prophets said about Jesus for them to believe that Jesus was the Son of God. Today, walking in the prophetic realm will give you the same power that the prophets of old had. If you are doubting, just remember that those prophets were operating by the same Holy Spirit who is in us today. If the Spirit in us is the same, why would we not have the same power as the prophets of old? The reason why the prophets of today may not wield the same power as the prophets of old has to do with the corruption of the world. To walk in the prophetic realm, you need to uphold strict rules. Some of those rules are borderline brutal. Here are some examples. God took away the wife of Ezekiel and told him not to lament or shed any tears, as written in the book of Ezekiel chapter 24 verse 16. Any prophet that would speak falsely would face a death penalty, as the book of Deuteronomy chapter 18 verse 20 states. With such strict conditions, you will also understand why the prophets had so much power. This is why I usually say, if you want more power from God, be ready for very strict conditions. If you want God to speak to you directly as he used to speak to the prophets, be ready to keep his commands even when they are borderline brutal. Now you may ask, how do you unlock the prophetic realm? By praying in the Spirit. The process is automatic, although it has conditions. Anytime you start speaking in tongues, the Holy Spirit lifts you to the spiritual realm. If you are defiled in sin, the Holy Spirit starts by removing the defilement in you. Once you are pure, he lifts your spirit into higher realms. The prophetic realms is one of the realms that the Holy Spirit lifts you to. Other realms include the throne of God, the garden of God's mysteries, the habitation of the men of faith who lived before us, etc. Depending on your desire and the state of your heart, the Holy Spirit will know what realm to take you to. Because I'm talking about the prophetic realm today, I'll give you the conditions of accessing the prophetic realm. The most important law in the prophetic realm is the purity of your tongue. When Isaiah the prophet was being ushered into the prophetic realm, a hot coal was put on his tongue to purify it, as the book of Isaiah chapter 6 verse 6 and verse 7 states. Once his tongue was purified, he was allowed to speak on behalf of God. If your tongue is defiled, God cannot let his word be spoken through it. Given that the most important organ in the body of a prophet is his tongue, you have no choice but to keep your tongue pure. When you pray in tongues and you want to access the prophetic realm, the Holy Spirit will begin purifying your tongue. You might feel literal fire on your tongue as the Holy Spirit purifies it. The greatest sign that your tongue is pure and you are ready to access the prophetic realm has to do with the inability to speak. There is a good reason why many prophets either had a speech defect or were generally not eloquent. Some of them would lose their speech temporarily from time to time. Take an example of Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist, who went mute until when John was born. Ezekiel also lost his speech at some point because God wanted him to remain silent. Moses had a speech defect that he felt unable to represent God in Egypt. Jeremiah told God that he was too young and he didn't know how to speak. When someone has a speech defect, they are mostly reserved. Because their tongue is idle most of the time, their chance of defiling it is very low. That is why God intentionally picks such people to be his prophets. Have you ever prayed in tongues and soaked so deep that you couldn't speak to people? That was the Holy Spirit stopping you from defiling your tongue so that God can use it. Once your tongue is pure and you pray in tongues fervently, you will be lifted up to the prophetic realm. There are 3 common ways that people access the prophetic realm. One is through dreams. If you ever dream of things and they come to pass, you have accessed the prophetic realm. God expects you to warn people of the things that you see in your dreams. That information is given to you for you to speak it because your tongue is pure enough to pass that message. 2. People access the prophetic realm while praying. This is where someone who is praying sees a vision of things to come or gets a message from the Holy Spirit about future events. This is also where interpretation of tongues comes in. Sometimes the Holy Spirit takes over the tongue of a person who is praying in tongues and uses it to pass forth a prophetic message. When the tongues are interpreted, the prophetic message is revealed. Lastly, God occasionally takes over people and speaks through them directly. In some cases, the people themselves do not realize that they are actually speaking prophetically. A good example is the book of John chapter 11 verse 51, which tells us that Caiaphas, who was the high priest at the time when Jesus was being crucified, spoke prophetically without knowing. Caiaphas suggested that it would be better for one man to die for many than for the whole nation to perish. His idea was taken and Jesus was crucified for the atonement of the sins of many. I hope you now realize that accessing the prophetic realm is not as complex as it might sound. Go for it. God bless you.